Hello and welcome to The Gist. I'm your host, Chris Vetrano, here every week to break down all the things that are happening in pop culture and interviewing the people that make it pop. Today, we're finally doing it. We're deep diving into one of the most celebrated pop culture icons and artists of all time, the pop princess herself, Britney Spears. As we prepare for the release of her new memoir, The Woman in Me, out October 24th, we're going to go back through the biggest moments of her iconic career. But I couldn't do it alone, so I brought in some help. You know him because he created the #1 stop on the internet for all things Britney. Please welcome to The Gist, founder of Breathe Heavy, Jordan Miller. Hey, Jordan.
Hey, what's going on? Thanks so much for the kind words. How you doing?
I'm doing good. I am excited to have you because you're a Britney expert and you have been doing this. I want to hear a little bit before we get started in talking about the Queen herself. I want to hear, how did you get started with Breathe Heavy, and where did you sort of, your love of Britney, where did it start?
Yeah, so long story short, I started this website, Breathe Heavy, when I was a sophomore in high school. So believe it or not, it's going to be turning 20 years old next year, which is wild to think that I have been working on something for nearly 2 decades. And to answer your question about, where the passion started, it's hard to pinpoint. I think like when you're young, you tend to gravitate towards a certain artist for whatever the reason may be. And mine happened to be Britney because, she was out the gate, like iconic and releasing great music and had a really unique look and sound. And, as a little gay boy, I thought that she was I knew that she was a queen and I wanted to stand.
Absolutely.
And then the rest is history. Like there's been a very long saga with Breathe Heavy in terms of covering, album releases and some of the tumultuous times, then into the conservatorship, and which led to Free Britney, and just everything in between. It's been a very colorful history. It's never been boring. It's always interesting, even to this day. But very grateful for Breathe Heavy and the community of fans, and of course for Britney.
Yeah. Well, and as you said, I mean, it wasn't just the little gay boys like us that found, a spark with Britney Spears, because she's sold over like 150 million records worldwide. She's one of the best-selling artists of all time. And after first appearing on the Mickey Mouse Club, which is where some people were first introduced to her, she signed with Jive Records at just 15 years old. And then Baby One More Time came into my life. And from that moment, I talked about it. I think it was in the last couple of episodes, I had talked about how Baby One More Time impacted me and how I found that song and was immediately like, this is my bitch. Like, I love her. Like, I need everything about her. From that moment on, was Baby One More Time also like your first introduction to Britney, or was it later?
No, definitely it was the Baby One More Time era. And I just recall kind of like one of my earliest memories of Britney is being at Borders, which no longer even exists, and looking at CDs, which also kind of no longer exist, and seeing the album cover and flipping the CD around. And I looked at the track list and I noticed there was a song called Soda Pop. And I was like, this has to be good. I just know it. I just know it's going to be a bop. And, sure enough, that album, changed my life in many ways. And it's just crazy to like look back on, like when I even just now kind of verbalizing some of these thoughts of like looking back at a time when Borders doesn't exist, CDs don't exist, like just the format of everything. And then to consider, the boom of digital media and social media and how that really in many ways has complicated things, I think, as a fan to an artist and vice versa. So there is a bit of nostalgia, of course, when I reflect back on some of the simpler times. And I know I sound like a grandpa being like, back in my day. But 20 years is, 20 plus. I think Baby One More Time came out 25 years ago as of like a couple days ago. I think the anniversary just hit.
Yeah.
And there's only so many things in life that remain that consistent, and music is one of them. And I'm sure you can speak for yourself, but like for me, it was Britney's been a huge staple um, in my life, and just in a lot of areas. And so yeah, it's just like fond memories to look back on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the album and song both came out in 1999,
Hmm.
and the album went on. It's one of the best-selling albums of all time. It sold 25 million copies worldwide, which is insane because, as you were
Hmm.
just talking about, the digital music is now everything streaming, and now everything
Hmm.
singles and single songs, and so people don't buy albums the way that they
Hmm.
used to back in that
Hmm.
day. And
Yeah.
so forever, I mean, Baby One More Time is going to be one of the greatest, like, or one of the top selling albums of all time
Hmm.
just because of the way that the format has changed.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I actually think that that's okay that music isn't consumed in the same exact way as it was 20 plus years ago. Because in 20 plus years from now, streaming will most likely be something that's archaic, is old.
Yeah.
And there'll be,
Yeah.
several new formats in the time in between. But no lies detected when you say that it's like just a record that stands the test of time. And actually, a few weeks ago, it, it's not too often that I go back and like play full albums. Like I'll listen to her music and the songs and here and there. I have like a go-to workout playlist of her bops and stuff. But to play like a
Yeah.
whole album in sequential order, I don't do too often. And I did play Baby One More Time, and it's like, yes, there's like some really good bops on it, but also like I kind of forgot that there is like some pretty great ballads and like slower songs and
Yeah.
mid-tempo songs, and just to kind of hear the
Yeah.
nuance in her voice, especially with the addition of AI now and AI generated vocals, and trying to see what AI is trying to produce, and in comparison, looking back on her earlier works, it really is like in a time capsule and very special.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with you, like the album. And I also recently listened to it kind of front to back. We had a friend in town and we were just like, oh, let's go like old school Britney. And so we threw on Baby One More Time. And it's like some of
Nice.
the songs I just like remember like how, I mean, it is like it's just nostalgic in so many ways, and the album had so many singles. I mean, we had Sometimes, You Drive Me Crazy, From the Bottom of My Broken Heart, Born to Make You Happy. But even beyond those, which were like huge, massive songs that we still hear and talk about today, it's like there was some really awesome. And then obviously, this was also in the time where there was there was like the US version, and then there was also like the Japanese version or something that
Hmm.
would come out, and it would always have like a few more songs. Some
Hmm.
of those songs are great too from her, like the B-sides, I guess.
Oh yeah, B-sides, like I mean, I guess who's not a big fan of them, but there's like something special about songs that were left on the cutting room floor or that were released in kind of like not like a wide release. And I tend to gravitate towards them quite frequently and look them up on YouTube if they're not like officially released on Spotify.
Yeah.
And I mean, that goes, throughout her entire career. Every album has B-sides that have surfaced. And some of my favorite songs of Britney in general are unreleased music. And I think that's part of why it's like the allure of, it's kind of feels like a secret, like you were part of this exclusive club that, not the general public doesn't really know about these songs. It makes them a little bit extra special.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the true fans, right? Like we know that, like I said, Baby One More Time, one of the greatest selling albums of all time. I mean, it also, at the time debuted at number one in 15 different countries. And the single also, Baby One More Time, sold more than 10 million copies. It sold 500,000 copies in its first day,
Hmm.
and is also one of the best selling singles of all time. And so obviously people talk about that song. And then, but I think the other thing that, Britney did with this sort of introduction at Baby One More Time is the videos. And you were talking kind of about like some YouTube is what made me kind of think of it, is like, because that's where I really go to for Britney, like nostalgia, is she was like the video queen back in
Hmm.
the day. You Drive Me Crazy, was the first making the music video, or making the video that MTV did. I remember like when it debuted, I was obsessed with the idea of the concept of the show itself, but then for the first episode to be crazy was in itself crazy. I was obsessed with that video. Is there
Mm-hmm.
one that like stuck from the Baby One More Time era that stuck out for you?
Good question. I would also agree with you with about Crazy because I do remember, the MTV special, and there's like this funny memory that I have of that song and that episode on MTV where it really hyped up the song. And this is like kind of embarrassing to say, but there was like there was like a talent show at my school, and I believe at this point I'm in sixth grade, and some of the most like popular girls in school for the talent show, they put together like a dance to Crazy, and they had like their little like crop tops and they crimped their hair. And I remember being like wanting to be a part of that. And I was like, I could be like, I play a role or whatever, but like, it just, you're not confident enough in sixth grade to really put yourself out there to be like, no, I need to be in this talent show. I have to be a part of this. I mean, I did end up like doing a whole freaking like entire full blown website and community for 20 years. So I did end up making up for it, but clearly that's still a point of contention.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I feel like, I always related to Britney, and because I was obviously in school as well when she was at her biggest, is I always like assumed or like thought of Britney as the most popular girl in school,
Mm-hmm.
and was like, oh yeah, this is like, if I went to school with Britney, like she'd be the most popular. And then of course the popular girls were the ones that were doing those things in the talent shows,
Yeah.
singing Britney Spears songs. And so it was like, it felt right.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Yeah.
Well, so she had this like incredible kind of start to her career, unmatched for most would say. I mean, the story in which she sort of like skyrocketed to fame really felt like it happened overnight. And then not long after, just a year later in 2000, she released Oops, I Did It Again. Also debuted at number one. It sold 1.3 million copies, breaking the record for the highest debut sales by a solo artist in its first week, and has gone on to sell over 20 million copies worldwide to date. Tell me about your thoughts on Oops. What happened? Where were you when it came out? How were you like, what were your thoughts when she kind of transitioned to this Oops, I Did It Again era?
Interesting to reflect also on that because that's also 20 plus years ago. And what were my thoughts? I think that I thought that at this point I'm a full blown stan. And I remember talking to my friends. I used to do gymnastics as like a team gymnastics competitor. And I remember talking to my gym buddies about the music video and the album when it came out. And I remember most of my friends commenting on how like hot she looked in the video. And I remember thinking like, yeah, like she's definitely fierce. But I was like, but like, the songs and like her looks, like I was definitely looking at it from just a different angle, obviously unknowingly at the time because I was still pretty young.
Right.
But at the time, the album sales and just the all of the hype and attention around her, it was all happening in real time. So in the moment, I wasn't super aware, and I was also young, so I didn't have so much like experience or even exposure to what other artists of her caliber experienced. And it was just kind of like very innocent in the way to like live in the moment and just like not, I don't know what, if this is not normal or normal. I just know that I really like her as an artist. I liked her for the last album, and now it feels like she's even more famous and making more music. And of course I love that. And it is again, like it's this theme of like, just like a precious time because we were like all very young.
Yeah, for me, it was definitely like, I felt like it was a departure from the first record. I remember like getting the album, I think like I had to get it after school or something the day it came out, and putting it in and just being like, oh wow, like this sounds like funkier. It sounds like sexier. Like I felt like she was being like a little bit more of a bad girl. I don't know why that felt that way, but I think just some of the like "Don't Go Knocking on My Doors" and some of the other like tracks on there just felt like, oh, she's like growing up, but she was still so young. But then, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the Oops era gave us so much because, as you mentioned, like I mean, she became kind of like at the biggest star in the world. And she obviously, this is when we got her famous VMA performance of Oops, where she ripped off the glittery black suit and revealed the glittery nude suit.
Mm-hmm.
And to for me, it's probably still to this date like the best VMA or probably award show performance that I've ever seen.
Mm.
And I remember just being like obsessed watching it over and over and over, trying to like learn the dance. And
Same.
I mean, it was amazing. And, you
Mm-hmm.
know, I remember like her being on the newspaper the next day, like the front page, her kind of like giving this like mischievous grin from the performance and, you know, it being like such a big deal. And that coming off of obviously she did the Rolling Stone cover, which was controversial because she was wearing underwear. And at the time, I like didn't understand like why is everyone like hating on Britney? And you know, now looking back, I'm like, okay, she was like pretty young doing these
Mm-hmm.
things, but you know, she was a star from the beginning. Um, Also during the era, we got the Super Bowl halftime show where she came out as a guest with NSYNC and Aerosmith,
Mm-hmm.
which I was obsessed with. She gave us two books, a Heart to Heart book release, and then a Mother's Gift. And she signed an $8 million deal with Pepsi. So just in this Oops era, she like really solidified herself as a star. You mentioned you also were learning the VMA dance. Was there something from this era that like sticks out for you?
Yeah, well, first, definitely want to comment on that VMA's performance because it still remains like
Yeah,
one of my favorites. And yes, I do recall at the time, like learning the try or like just trying to like be in my room and like live my best life and like
yeah,
recreate the scene where she like throws her hands on that like the stair railing and then goes up and down and then turns her head, walks, and then just like the rest is history. And she
yeah,
reveals the like the nude tone glittery outfit. And I love your perspective of like looking back and like actually kind of analyzing the music and comparing it from one album to the next. I definitely wasn't like aware enough, I don't think at the time to like have the tools to do that. And I think like in hindsight, I could tell the music was a little bit more up tempo, kind of like how I mentioned that Baby One More Time had like a lot of mid tempos and some ballads and a little bit slower.
yeah,
I definitely, in hindsight, realized that Oops, I Did It Again was more fast paced. It was more like what we would consider quote unquote pop. And I do remember at the time liking that more and gravitating towards that
right,
more. And, as we kind of like venture into these eras, it continued through the Britney era and so on to get immersed more in pop. So I think like kind of
yeah,
playing off of what you mentioned, like I do recall feeling like, okay, these songs are like, these are my vibe. Not that the other ones weren't, but those were like
hmm,
more my vibe. And it was really like at that
yeah,
point, I think I started to kind of explore like my tastes in music, which led me down to, kind of looking at other artists. But, of course, she's kind of remained on this, on this pedestal for me as I was a kid. Um,
yeah.
and also, side note, I'm loving all of the data you're presenting. I work for Amazon and data is like such a huge part of everything. So props to you for doing your homework and bring in the receipts.
Yeah, well, I have to have some kind of facts on this so that I don't just gush about her for an hour, and because I could do that too, but have to
Go
like
for it. Do
also
it.
bring some facts so that so that people know why I'm gushing. Because
Gotcha.
like even though Britney was like the biggest star, and also I mean at the time because like this bubblegum pop like craze was starting. Obviously, there was the boy band era. We had the other Britneys, the Christina, Jessica Simpson, Mandy Moore. Like we were getting all these people. But in music in general, people always talk about the sophomore slump and that's going to be like, can they do it again? And I think like in this era, like Britney really showed, yes, I'm here to stay. I'm like a staple in pop. And then, as I mentioned, like there was all these things, the $8 million deal with Pepsi. And, she was really just starting to solidify herself as the celebrity and one of the biggest stars of all time, really,
Mm-hmm.
in that moment. And as you started to allude to, is in that kind of continued on into 2001. It was crazy because, she was also doing all these albums one year after, like one after another, just with like a year apart or really no breaks.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it all feels like all of these things happen together. But
Mm-hmm.
in 2001, she released Britney. Also debuted at number one, sold 10 million copies worldwide. It was a more adult record. She, definitely like wanted to shed sort of this like young girl image that people kept putting on her. So she had "I'm a Slave for You," "I'm Not a Girl," "Overprotected," "I Love Rock and Roll," and "Boys" were all the singles. She went on the Dream Within a Dream tour, probably like at the time was one of the biggest tours. It grossed $43.7 million. And we also in this era really got the height of the Justin and Britney relationship that became such a focus. And we got her first major motion picture, Crossroads, in 2002.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about the Britney era and kind of like what you remember. What are your highlights from that era?
So the Britney era, I think, as I'm taking this trip down memory lane, um, this is when I really started to follow more of like the, I think, artistic side of her career. And I was really into like knowing about the photo shoots that she did and who the photographer was and why they styled things a certain way and the album artwork. That's when I really started to kind of like have more of like a marketing lens, even though I was still fairly young. And at this
Right.
point, I'm visiting, fan sites to keep up with all of the news. I mean, you listed out a bunch of things that she did, but there was, countless other events that she would go to, or there was paparazzi photos. And I wanted to like really absorb all of that because, at that point I went to like a really hard private school and I was competing in gymnastics, which was at least 3 hours of training every single day, 6 days a week. So I really
Wow.
had this bit of like an escape, I guess, to be able to like just immerse myself in this world, and follow her career and just take my mind off of the day to day of just having to push myself, in all those areas. And in terms of like kind of some shining moments from the Britney era, I really remember being impressed with Slave for You because her working with Pharrell and the Neptunes, it was a different sound for
Right.
her. And I remember someone that I knew, I believe it was my cousin, she said how Britney's vocals just sound like robotic and fake. And I just remember thinking at the time, like, I didn't necessarily even agree with that, but I also thought like the overall production of the song and like the vocal and all of it tied together was hot. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's what, makes a great pop song. That who gives a shit about
Yeah.
if it's 100% organic vocals. Like it's supposed to be a pop record. It's supposed to allow you to take yourself out of your day to day, which I
Yeah.
was unknowingly doing at the time, and presumably still doing.
Yeah.
So definitely the music again was like another evolution, and I bought in. I loved the sound of the record. I remember, you mentioned Crossroads. It's super fun to see that the movie's coming out again, in a couple weeks for fans to kind of like relive.
Right.
And that produced the iconic Slave for You performance of the VMAs, which
Yeah.
I think I mentioned the 2000 performance is maybe my favorite. I don't know. The Slave for You one was just, I remember at the time watching it. And this is, really, I mean, the internet was around, but TV could get away with airing something on the East Coast and then waiting 3 hours and no one knowing on the West Coast. So when I saw it, it was news to me.
Right.
And that would never happen now.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I remember like seeing the snake and just being like, she is so like badass. And
Yeah.
I just felt like she was fearless. And of course, there's like interviews that she's done, saying that was a little bit of a terrifying experience for her. But the point is that she exuded this confidence, and it's something I've always like admired about
Right.
her. So when I look back on that time, that's kind of like the impression that I was left with.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and I think the VMA, I think some of the VMA producers have like called it one of the greatest VMA performances of all time from their perspective, because it took so many risks with the tiger on the stage and the boa and all the things that she did, and it's like it really. I mean, it's one of her most iconic looks. Obviously, people do it for Halloween every year, and it is something that like will live on forever, which is really the true test of like a pop culture moment, or and for her being an icon. And it was just this like incredible time where you kind of alluded to this, is that in this era was really when paparazzi and where like Britney's behind the scenes, it was like she was the biggest star lit of being the pop princess in her first two records, but it was really like it took another level where people became so obsessed with her and what was happening behind the scenes. A lot of that was like the Justin and Britney romance, and that people became obsessed with. And so it really did start shifting the way that we consumed things, because like you said, the internet was starting to come around. Like it was really like, oh, I can go online and start learning about all of these other things. And so it really like became that, as well as her career, which she was sort of like fighting both things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a really transitional year, which I feel like leads us to the next album, which is In the Zone. The album also debuted at #1, which made her the first female artist in SoundScan era to have her first 4 studio albums debut at #1. Gave us the singles Me Against the Music, Toxic, Every Time, Outrageous. And she also got her first Grammy award for Toxic during this era. But this was also the era where a lot of the sort of media chaos was happening, because she got married in Vegas to Jason Alexander in January 2004, and then in July of 2004 was dating Kevin Federline. She did the Chaotic TV show. So she really was starting to kind of become something more and probably bigger than herself, really, during this time. And at what year? Remind me, when did Breathe Heavy start?
So Breathe Heavy did start. This is the era that it all began. It started
Okay,
in
that's what I
2000
thought.
started in 2004, but I actually had to spend a year, which was 2003, learning how to build a website. This was before the drag and drop functionality that you can do now, where you can build a website in like literally an hour. This was learning how to code. So I was following along on the Britney saga and seeing how, just the magnitude of everything, which, inspired me to want to make a website and have like a place where people could go to read about her. I wanted to be someone who could like produce the news. And yeah, so long story short, I spent a year learning how to do it and then launched it the very last day of my sophomore year in June 2004. School ended, went home, I was already built, and published it. And I was publishing it to like no one, because no one knew about it. And I don't know. At the time, again, it was just like a good, innocent time where it didn't matter to me about traffic and engagement and all these metrics that I
Right.
try to hit now, which, for the most part, I try to look the other way because I want to enjoy it, and it kind of takes the fun out of it.
Right.
But yeah, it was 2004, the In the Zone era.
Yeah, I thought that was probably about the time, because I remember I've been on Breathe Heavy back in these days. Like I
Oh,
remember
cool.
finding, because I think what Breathe Heavy did is when the media was really starting to turn on Britney during these
Mm-hmm.
times, because she was, becoming, I mean, she was truly just a 20-year-old or whatever, however old she was at that time, like doing what most 20-year-olds do, which is like go out, party, do things. But it really took like a different shape, because apparently she needed to be a certain kind of role model. And so the
Mm-hmm.
media really turned on her. And I think what Breathe Heavy did was it gave people like me who wanted to follow the news a place to go and like hear positive things and like talk
Mm-hmm.
about like yes, this thing is happening, but there was always like, you knew that you were reading something from a fan. So you knew that you
Mm,
weren't going to like get a perspective of like, we're just selling the paper and we're trying to make it
mm-hmm,
shocking just to
mm-hmm,
like, get the headline.
mm.
And so I remember that being kind of like the reason that I would go to Breathe Heavy back in the day.
Love that. Honestly, I really appreciate you saying that because that is still the lens that I try to look through. It's still, along the way, I make mistakes and I posted things that I look back, I'm like, that probably shouldn't have, or maybe I shouldn't have said it like that. Or, I frequently kind of run into these forks in the road, a crossroads, if you will.
Yeah.
Sorry. um,
There we go.
but that's one thing that I've always tried to do is like, spin the news in a way where it's like, this is what's going on, and it may not be like the most like kind or like lighthearted news. It may be like a tough pill to swallow, but I've never been a big fan of looking the other way, and it just feels like a bit of censorship to me. I feel like there's a way you can go about sharing information that's relevant. Not everything needs to be shared, and there's plenty of things throughout the years that has crossed my path that I choose to, that is an appropriate time to look the other way or to make that decision of like, this isn't a good fit for Breathe Heavy. And along the way I've gotten a lot of criticism for, certain stories or my stance, or people saying I'm, part of the conservatorship team, or just like all of these kinds of crazy things. But to hear from someone who's been, kind of following along for this amount of time, to highlight the point that I've always tried to, especially from the very beginning, portray Britney in a positive light. I appreciate that greatly. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and it's ridiculous to say that you're part of that like grouping of people because of like, you are such a fan and that's where all
Mm-hmm.
of this came from. And also like, you don't have to apologize for, saying things back in the day, because the time was different. I had a music blog for many years that I ran and wrote things, and I have written some very unfavorable things that I hope no one ever finds,
Mm-hmm.
that just aren't very nice, and it's nasty, and like, it's the days of Perez Hilton, and like, that was what seemed like, what people were sharing their opinions online for the
Mm-hmm.
first time, really, and saying whatever they wanted to. And even today I have lots of opinions about Britney, but I it's taken me a long time on this podcast to even talk about Britney, because I want to celebrate what Britney Spears is and was, and I don't want to like focus on the things that now could potentially do damage to her in some kind of way,
Mm-hmm.
when with all these people talking about that. And so it
Mm-hmm.
was a different time, and so if you wrote something that somebody doesn't like today, like
Mm-hmm.
apologize for it and move on,
Mm-hmm.
because what you were doing, I think, is like, you were still celebrating who she was, which was sharing the news about her. And so I think that that's still great.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. It was like the internet, back. So now we're kind of like venturing into the next kind of era here, the blackout era, and this is
Yep.
really when I think the internet was at its meanest. It's still,
Yep.
can be a very dark place, but I think millennials, the kind of the people who grew up with the internet, we've all, for the most part, collectively tried to, I think, raise the bar. Obviously, there's still just tons and tons of negative people, and there's a lot of people who just say terrible things, and there's no accountability. But having a website, I was always held accountable, and I always had to make sure that I tried my best anyhow to make sure that whatever I would say, it put Britney in a good light. It felt good, but there's times where, you're not sure of how to proceed with the story or whatnot.
Yep.
But you kind of mentioned some of the other blogs from back then. And it's like, yeah, that was like how you became a kind of a media force.
Yeah.
And I, in some ways, was mean. I'll like looking back, I was not mean towards Britney, but people around her.
Right.
I still like kind of share the same sentiment that I do now with some of those people. Like I'm not a big fan, but how I would go about using my own energy to write about them or to drag them. I just don't do now, obviously. And that's what happens
Right.
when you're, now at this point, I believe in the blackout era, I'm 18, 19, 20 years old. That's what happens when you're
Yeah.
that age in comparison to me being 35 years old now. You grow and you learn from those experiences. But in terms of Britney, like always was like, I have her back. Like
Yeah.
she, and still same to this day. Like I'm like, and now I have like this, not to jump ahead, but it's like to compare and contrast the two. It's like now I have like an even bigger and wider reach on the internet in comparison to them. Like Breathe Heavy
Right.
got a lot of traffic back then, but it's been all these like stepping stones to be what it is now. And so now I have to really make sure that what I put out there, I have to like really think about.
Yeah.
And anyway, there's a whole rabbit hole we can go down with this, but we'll kind of like pivot back to the iconicness of Blackout.
Yeah. And, before we jump into Blackout too, like, as you were saying, like this was really the height of all of the kind of like media. She, when she had to cancel the In the Zone tour, she kind of, a lot of things sort of ensued. I think chaotic being the TV show is like kind of the right word for all of that. Because between 2004 and 2007, she also released the first greatest hits album with My Prerogative. She had both of her sons. She divorced K-Fed. It's also when, she famously shaved her head, and which people, remember when they think of her, obviously. And then Blackout was, there was a lot of controversy around the album itself, but is actually one of the most celebrated. It was the first time that she had an album that didn't debut at number one. It debuted at number two in the US. It did win Album of the Year at the MTV Europe Music Awards. It gave us 3 singles, but there was a lot of kind of controversy around it. And it was really like, even though, critically it was one of her most celebrated albums as like this incredible kind of like electronic dance album. And, but it was unfortunate that like behind the scenes, this is also when she gets placed on the psychiatric hold and the conservatorship comes into play. And we're starting to get into this time. And so it was a really kind of strange era to be a fan, because we loved what we got from Blackout as a fan. But on the other flip side, it was like all of this stuff was happening to her and kind of falling apart in front of our eyes.
I was gonna say, I feel like I agree with that assessment, but a little shift for me is that there was like a lot of stuff going on and being criticized about Britney herself. But I think there was like a real separation between her and the album. I think like a lot of people recognize that it was like a critically acclaimed album, that it sounded amazing. And I don't recall like too much heat around the album and criticism about that, but about her, I mean, if anyone would know, it would be me, because I literally documented like every paparazzi trip, every rumor, like it's all in the Breathe Heavy archives that I have stored on a database. It's like a weird journal that I have. And yeah, there was just so much. And that's like to the point of what you mentioned, of just like how I try to portray Britney in a positive light throughout things. This is, I think, really when I leaned in. At this point, I'm 20 years old, and this is the year that I met Britney. I met her before the VMAs in Vegas, before the 2007 VMAs. And kind of how all that came to be was because she had been reading Breathe Heavy at that point and could see that the angle that I was going with was such a pivot from what she was used to seeing. Everyone was just right, trying to destroy her and drag her down. And there was like one kind of corner on the internet that really went out of its way to make sure that it wasn't that. And it wasn't just me. It was like, I had the platform, I created the platform, Breathe Heavy, but it boils down to like my news posts combined with the community of fans. So Britney fans, they wanted to have like a dedicated place to go. It's really the fans of hers that I think is what the special sauce was, because you could go to People Magazine or some of these other blogs and you could read the comments and they're all just terrible. And the general public generally speaking, was not nice. And so it was like a breath of fresh air to go to a place where it wasn't going to be this doom and gloom about her, even though everything was being reported on the website and
Mm-hmm.
in the forum. It was a place to go to like find some solace from like, this is my beloved pop star. I've stand her for a number of years now, and I just want to be able to
Yeah.
talk to like-minded people to still continue to celebrate her. And Breathe Heavy is, in my
Yeah.
opinion, still that to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, during the kind of conservatorship of it all, like at the time, we didn't really know what was happening. And we like, there was obviously some photos of her in an ambulance, and when there were stories and there was all kinds of things out. And, it was like, it was scary as a Britney Spears fan at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so to the point is like going to Breathe Heavy is like, oh, I can go there to sort of find out like what's happening. Or just go there to like be with other Britney fans and talk about sort of what is potentially happening and how we might be able to get her back.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was interesting when I put this together, and, we could do a whole episode on the conservatorship, and nor do I really want to do that because I don't want to give it a lot of life, because it's
Agreed.
horrible. But it was so interesting to me as I was putting this together is like seeing the timeline of it and seeing like, oh, she got placed on the conservatorship. And then it was like almost immediately after she was released from the hospital, she was on How I Met Your Mother. She did Britney for the Record. She was like just back to work, which brings
Mm-hmm.
us to the next era, which is in 2008. She released the Circus album, which
Mm-hmm.
also debuted at #1 again. So she was back on the top of the charts. Womanizer topped the Billboard Hot 100 for the first time since Baby One More Time.
Mm-hmm.
And she went on the circus tour. And it's like, it's insane to think, I mean, and then obviously there's more to her story and her career to come, but like, it's crazy to think like, well, all of this was happening and there was all these horrible things being said about her. She got back to work and she was like truly like doing it again. Like she was
Mm-hmm.
still delivering things at the top of the charts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like one of the, I think, pivotal moments of her career that I feel is very inspirational. It's like she was at a seemingly low point, and they put her in a situation that was unjust and corrupt, and she still managed to pick herself up and push herself artistically, professionally, as a mom, just as a human being. And I kind of think back to those moments. When I struggle with certain things, it's like, okay, like pick yourself up, push yourself, you can do this. And I think that there's like two sides of the coin here when it comes to like her kind of this quote unquote resurgence with circus. It's like on the one hand, I personally do well when I have structure and work. I tend to thrive a little bit better than if I'm just left to my own devices and have kind of like a super open schedule. But at the same time, I think in her case, it was like used as a tool. Like if you do XYZ, then you'll be out of the situation. And she played the game that they forced her to be in. She was an unwilling participant. And I think that's why there's such a kind of, I think, difference between circus and then the next era. Because it was like, well, the situation didn't change. So not to get too far into the conservatorship, I know that this is like a very music focused chat, but at the same time, it's hard to untangle the two. Because it kind of the personal situation in many ways informed the professional situation and vice versa. So kind of this is where things get a little more complicated and tangled.
And I mean, it is music focused and celebrating who she is, but it's part of her story. And I think I'm hoping, I'm hopeful, not to jump ahead, of like The Woman in Me and the things that we might learn and like what Britney could actually do for conservatorships and people that are in similar situations for the future. And so it's definitely part of her story. And, she I think it is interesting. We'll transition to go to what you said is she released the singles collection after Circus, which had the single Three. Three became her third number one song. So again, she's still like churning out some of the biggest, sales of her entire career. And then she releases in 2011, 2 years later, Femme Fatale. So the album did peak at number one. Hold It Against Me debuted at number one. It also had these singles Till the World Ends, I Want to Go. And it's the first album in which 3 of its songs reached the top 10 of the charts. So, and then it also had Criminal. This is also the time where we got S&M Remix with Rihanna, which became her 5th number one. Be in the Mix remixes came out. She was on the X Factor. She had Scream and Shout with will.i.am, Ooh La La for the Smurfs movie. I mean, girl was busy during this time. But to your point, and I think what you were alluding to is like the spark wasn't maybe there as much during this era, because I think for her, she was maybe starting to recognize what the abuse and the things that were happening behind the scenes with the conservatorship, that this was what was going on.
Yeah. I mean, there was like a ton of things that you just mentioned. And I think, I obviously don't know for sure, and perhaps this will be revealed in the book, but I would imagine if it were me in a situation similar to that, I would at some point, in order to just survive, you have to almost like accept the situation so you can cope, so you can like do things day to day. Otherwise, if you're just continually dwelling and looking back, it's like you're going to get stuck. And I think that's perhaps kind of a mode that she put herself in of like, okay, I'm going to get through this. I'm going to continue to push forward. And, had all of this amazing success, but of course, behind the scenes, she wasn't being able to live her authentic life in a way that she choose to do so. And I think that's, you mentioned the kind of the spark fading in certain eras. I think this is kind of around that time where she's doing X Factor and the Femme Fatale. And this is also, the beginnings of the conservatorship and adjusting to what this, legal prison is like for her. And so it's like, I would imagine there's a bit of some dissonance for her to be experiencing all of these, accolades and career defining moments. But yet the other side is that there's this really dark underbelly of everything. And she's having to kind of reckon with that.
Yeah, and not getting to probably celebrate those things the way that other artists that have, career milestones and number one songs on Hot 100, the way that they're celebrating these things. Britney wasn't getting the opportunity to do those things and allowed to do those things, which I think probably was part of it. Because I always think back to of like, when we talked about the early Britney and when we first were introduced to her in Baby and the Oops eras, is like I remember Rosie O'Donnell had her show and Britney was like a staple on the Rosie show, and she was always going and stopping by. And I just remember she like always Rosie O'Donnell just made her laugh in a way that I felt like no one else really like did. And she would laugh so much and she had so much personality, and it was like, oh, that's who Britney Spears is. And she, she had that personality in a lot of other things that we've seen her in. And I mean, even when you see like Crossroads, how she shows up is like, that's the spark. And I think that's what was missing. And so when she has this like dynamic personality and is such the kind of girl next door, and then she kind of is seemingly like afraid around people, and she's like timid of talking and all of the things that we've kind of started seeing, it was signs, I think, to fans that like something isn't going right. Like something, there was a lot of speculation as to like what it was that was causing all of that, but little did we know how deep it actually went.
Yeah, well, it's like who gives a shit about a number one if you aren't able to freely drive your car or choose your lawyer or your doctor or have say in your, the visitation of your children, and their children are used as like a tool against you to comply. Like, okay, great. A number one's great, but my life isn't like super meaningful in the ways that, they could be. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a tough era. It gave us some incredible Britney Spears songs. I mean, Femme Fatale. I listed all the singles. I mean, some of those singles are some of my favorites from her.
Hmm.
And so I am grateful for the album. But you know, obviously, there's a lot behind the scenes that was happening as well.
Mm.
Um, and that brings us to the next era. 2 years later, 2013, she released Britney Jean. It was her final album under Jive Records, under the deal that she had signed. And it debuted at number 4. It was her lowest selling album. It had Work Bitch and Perfume as the singles. And during this era, she had released a couple of other songs, one with Miley Cyrus, SMS Bangers, Pretty Girls with Iggy Azalea, Tom's Diner. She released a couple of like things out there. But really, I think to go off of what you were just saying and about the, you know, all the things that were going, you know, Britney Jean being the lowest selling is not surprising because at this point, I feel like it was coming out in the music as well.
Mm, yes, agreed. And the elephant in the room with this album is, it's fans dissect the songs and question whether her vocals are 100% on every single song. And that kind of has eclipsed the music when you look back on this album. And so to your point, it's like, yes, I think that this is now manifesting in her music because there's just, this is all speculation, of course, on my part, but it's like perhaps there's like a lack of connection to the music because the meaningful areas of her life, she's not fulfilled in the ways that she could be if there wasn't the kinds of restraints on her. So it, for it to debut at number 4, like whether, I think like there was a time where like the number ones and stuff were like super, super exciting for her. But I think as time went on, I think if she, I think that stuff became less important to her. And it was more about like trying to find connection and meaning in life. So like I presume Britney's point of view of like it debuting at number 4 is like, whatever, I have bigger fish to fry. But like fans want her to be like number 1 at all times. And so I remember there being a bit of like some discourse about that. But that album it's got some bops for sure, but kind of like how I mentioned, I revisited Baby One More Time in full not too long ago. It's been a minute since I fired up Britney Jean. So that's all I got to say about Britney Jean.
No, enough said on that too. Yeah, I mean, every artist has one. Sort of, if it has to be, what is this? Was this her 8th album? Now I can't remember. But I mean, it's insane. I mean, that's an incredible milestone to get to her 8th album and have it be the lowest selling. So, and then her final album in 2016, Glory. Again, a lot of speculation, as you mentioned, about like the connection. Was she there? Is she on all of the songs? There was a lot of talk about this with Glory as well. And I think in this era, like, I think it's probably one of her strongest videos that I have, in my sort of Britney Spears top videos of Slumber Party. I mean, I think she looks incredible in that video. I think that like the dances and the way that they put it together, the looks, I think everything was like hitting. But again, we're getting closer to this understanding that like something isn't right. Something's not like, all cylinders are not firing quite right with Britney and her team and what's going on. And I think, again, we just sort of got trumped by all of those things during this era.
I have a bit of a different kind of recollection of Glory because I recall feeling like now I feel like I was tricked in a way. Like I feel like when I look back on that era, I knew the conservatorship was still in place and that it was wrong, but I almost like started to I really felt like she was thriving in that era, even though we know now she wasn't. Behind the scenes there was things that she was fighting for and all that, but that knowledge wasn't available to us at the time. And I remember thinking like her performances she's slaying. Her body was honestly like in the best shape, you know, that she had been in a really long time. Like she looked physically like an athlete,
Yeah.
and just was doing interviews and doing traditional promo. And I really felt like she was like I think she was in a better place in some regards. And that's why I think like when there's like a lot of conversation about how, you know, Britney might be now, and people want the old Britney back and all this kind of like chatter. I have hope for her that she's going to be able to kind of, when she wants to, of course, return, you know, on her own terms. She can,
Yeah.
because she's done it
Yeah.
before. You know, Femme Fatale was, I think, like a bit of a rough patch. This is my own 2 cents. Maybe it wasn't for her, but just kind of like through the lens of me covering everything. It was a bit of a rough time. And then she was able to come out with Glory, where the visuals were amazing and she just seemed so healthy and cogent. And that's not to say to comment on her now. I just think in 2016, when that album came out, it was really heightened. And I'm like annoyed at myself for kind of like letting myself be complacent in some regards. I would still speak out against the conservatorship when articles would come out and a court date would happen, and I'd be like, it's still happening. But
Right.
I feel like I lost a bit of my own like tenacity with everything going on in her situation, because it appeared to me that she was kind of had worked through it, and it was like maybe it was a good setup for her. I thought, well, what the hell do I know? I don't know her. I don't know her situation so intimately, and the doctors, and maybe this is like a good situation for her, and obviously it wasn't.
Right.
And so when I look back on Glory, I conflate the two. It's like, oh, she was killing it, but at the same time I'm like, damn, Jordan, like, why did you kind of like just continue? Like, I reported a lot about the stories with a bit of like some skepticism, but it was more neutral obviously than when it first started out.
Right.
So to kind of end the musical era on that note, didn't love that. And I'm looking forward to hopefully one day her putting out a new record, and kind of being able to cover it with that kind of tenacity that I had before.
Yeah. And I think you're right. Like there was a bit of like coming off of Britney Jean. I think it did feel more like a return to form in a lot of ways. So I like can understand where you felt that. I think also something we didn't mention is the Piece of Me Vegas show happened during the Britney Jean era, and you know, is one of the. I mean, she changed the game in Vegas in terms of residency, and so I think doing all those shows, she was an athlete. She was showing up and doing that time and time again. And so I think that like all of that was happening, and then Glory, she was sort of in the music. Or in the performing kind of mindset from that. So I think that's where we get that in the videos. It's why like as I said, like the Slumber Party video is one of my favorites. But I think that there was something about like Britney used to talk about her music and the creative process of it. And, Max Martin obviously was a big contributor to her career and her musical catalog, but other people that have worked with her have also come out and said like how she shows up and how she has like a lot of thoughts about like how songs should be arranged and where things should have ad libs, and that she was always very collaborative in the studio. And I feel like maybe that's to me what was missing from these last few projects was that I don't know that she was doing more than just showing up and singing what she was told to sing so that she could go home and, maybe get, whatever they were kind of holding over her head in order to do that, which is horrible. But
I'll quickly comment on that too. Like, I also think like what you kind of just described, I definitely project onto Britney Jean, but I always recall like Glory of being an album where she did have a bit more control. Like maybe the creative process, I'm not quite sure what that looked like for her, but I remember thinking when I was first listening to the music that I was like, oh, this is definitely her vocals. Like this is definitely her. And like some of the songs that were selected, like Man on the Moon, for example, is like kind of like a bit to the left, out of left field in some ways. And I'm like, that's cool that she is selecting these types of songs, because it just felt like Britney Jean was just this just very like stale, like cold in a way. I don't mean to be
Yeah.
like rude about her music. Like hopefully I'm not coming across that way. I just think Britney Jean and
No.
Glory, they're just night and day. And so I remember
Yeah.
thinking like, okay, the music sounds really good. She looks amazing, fit, like interviews are awesome. And so, yeah, it was definitely like, and it's wild to think that that was 2016 and we're like approaching 2024. Like, what the
Yeah.
hell?
Yeah. I know a lot has happened, and we've gotten some songs. We got Hold Me Closer. We've gotten Mind Your Business. We've gotten some stuff from her, but we have
Mm,
our, I don't want to say we're due an album because it's up to Britney at this point, what she wants to do. And we as
mm-hmm,
fans like want her to, take her time. And if she never wants to deliver that, then that's where we're at. But,
mm-hmm,
a lot of things happened. Obviously we know, the Free Britney movement. Again, we could have a whole episode about that. Maybe someday we will. I know you were a big part of that. Britney is now free. And now on October 24th, we're getting The Woman in Me, which she signed this $15 million book deal. And, it's apparently going to be explosive, at least if we're reading what the media has to say. What are you hoping to get out of The Woman in Me as a Britney stan and as the creator of this like number one spot to find Britney online?
what I'm hoping is that I, for one, I don't have too many expectations, to be honest with you. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just like open to reading what she has to say. I'm open to whatever her words are because you know, I love her as an artist and as, you know, a person in some ways, I guess. It sounds kind of creepy. But I've just followed her for so many years, and so
Yeah.
I think that she's a badass. And so I look forward to reading what she's curated, what she wants people to know. And actually, just like 10 minutes before this interview that we're doing, she posted on Instagram that she's working on a volume 2 potentially. So
Yeah.
I find that to be super interesting. Even if she's just messing around, it's cool to see that she's got writing on the brain and that she's wanting to express herself. And so I'm looking forward to kind of just being a part of the experience of Britney expressing herself.
At this point, I think we're all just wanting to hear from Britney herself. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I remember that court call where we were all like tuned in to hear her speak for the first time, and so much was revealed. And it's like now we're going to get that on the pages, and we're going to get to really see more about like what she was experiencing, what she went through, but I think this is also, from my perspective, I think this is going to be, or I hope this will be a very healing moment for Britney in knowing that the world has like seen her story, has heard her story now. And as you mentioned, the volume 2 is like, maybe that's her starting to come out of her shell again and to go like, oh, now I can explore other areas because I've told this story of the darkness and the things that I went through. And the things that people didn't see when I was, the small town girl, that they all thought I was for all these years. She's starting to give us that. And my hope is that if nothing else, because obviously I'll read it and I will absorb every moment of it and I'm sure I will love it, but I'm hoping more than anything else that this ends up being a very healing time for Britney in
Mm-hmm.
sharing the story, and that it could lead to a volume 2 or a song or an album or a tour, or on her own terms, because I think
Mm-hmm.
Britney is the best when she's on her own terms. And
Mm-hmm.
so I really hope that that's what we get from this.
Agreed. I think like, you know, all of us are our best selves when we can live our authentic life and choose to do what we want on our own terms. And it's cool to see her being able to kind of flex her creativity and the writing process. I know, and she's mentioned was uh, a bit of a bit traumatizing to kind of relive some of these past experiences. But I think
Yeah.
sometimes in order for you to move forward, you you look back on certain parts of your life and reflect on them. And what you can do is then in the present moment, shift how you perceived those things so that when you look back on them in the future, you have a kind of a different stance. And I think that this book in some ways is doing that for her.
Yeah.
And just, per usual, I root for her. I know fans have a lot of love for her, and everyone just wants to see her, live life, like you mentioned, on her own terms. And this is a manifestation of that. So really looking forward to the book. Hopefully we get to look forward to volume
Yes.
2. And I know that you mentioned kind of like, the hopes of new music one day. I'm on the same page, as long as, again, it's
Yeah.
on her own terms. But would absolutely love that for her, and just, would love in some regard, in some way, to be a part of that somehow,
Yeah.
and helping kind of make that happen for fans. So, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well, you have been a huge part of her story, and
Oh,
as I mentioned, I've been a longtime reader, and it's a place that I have gone for the good stuff in Britney, and seeing that, and I see what you're doing on Instagram and some of the other platforms where you're really like focusing on when someone takes something that Britney posts on Instagram and turns it into headlines about her safety, or whatever. I see you sort of changing the narrative in a way that's really positive, and so
thank you.
I appreciate that, and continue doing that.
Hell
um,
yeah.
so thank you again for coming and doing this, and walking through Britney. I will be so excited to hear your thoughts on the book and all the things to come. But for folks out there, tell them where they can follow you, where they can find Breathe Heavy and you, and continue to kind of stay up to date.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. You did an amazing
Of course.
job, and I just really appreciate you knowing all the facts and bringing the tea, and just being able to, for both of us, to escape from our day to day to chat about our girl. And everyone listening, thank you so
Yes.
much for listening. You've made it this far in, so you rock. Thank you. And if you want to connect, visit breatheheavy.com, or you can find me on Instagram. It's at breatheheavy. I'm on Twitter and TikTok, and I have a personal Instagram and all that jazz. But just feel free to shoot me a message on your social media platform of choice, and I'd love to hear from you. And just very, very grateful for the Breathe Heavy community and for Britney fans and for opportunities like this. So thank you, and sending you lots of good vibes.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for doing this and chatting, Brittany. And for all of you, thank you for listening. Don't forget, you can get Brittany's book. It's out October 24th, The Woman in Me. And don't forget to rate and subscribe so that you never miss an episode of The Gist. You can find me at CM Vetrano on Instagram, Threads, Twitter, or TikTok. And until next week, thank you guys so much for listening. Bye.
See you later.